Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the August meeting of the Potomac River Basin's Drinking Water Source Protection Partnership, affectionately known as DWSP. And if you're a newcomer, welcome. And if you're an old timer, also welcome. And everybody else in between, thanks for caring about protecting the Potomac River Basin and working to that end with this group. Today, we've got a couple of interesting sounding presentations on a topic that's been relevant since the very beginning of DWSP, road salt or other de-icing materials. We try to think about these kinds of problems before they become catastrophic. It's difficult in our business to stay ahead of the curve of all the things that people don't realize in society make their way into drinking water. We've hosted very eminent speakers in the past, maybe at the beginnings of their careers, and then watched them go on to great success in this arena. We are excited today to welcome two guest speakers. And I'll introduce the first one right away. This morning, Greg Sandi from Maryland Department of the Environment is giving us a talk about Sometimes Less is More, Maryland's voluntary smart salting approach. Greg is the division manager of the Watershed Restoration Planning Division at Maryland Department of the Environment. This position serves in the Watershed Protection, Restoration, and Planning Program, helping to oversee MDE's Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts, as well as the state's non-point source pollution program. This includes working with state and local partners throughout Maryland to develop watershed restoration plans, managing best management practice data, tracking and evaluating the Chesapeake Bay model inputs and outputs. The main focus of Greg's position is to enhance water quality and ecological uplift in the state's aquatic ecosystems and to assist others in local restoration efforts. Greg received his BS in environmental management from the University of Maryland's Global Campus and his master's degree in environmental science and policy from Johns Hopkins University. So, Greg, take it away.
Good morning. Yeah, and I certainly won't be one of those eminent people that you mentioned before. I'm already like midway through my career, so let me know if you guys can hear me. Are we good?
Yep, we can hear and see you.
All right, great. So welcome everyone, and thank you for the introduction. This is something that MDE has been working on for quite some time. It's just taken a lot more effort than we had originally anticipated to get to where we are today, but I'm glad you're here to listen and ask questions. So if you would advance the slide, please. So one of the things that we've been doing in the past 3 years is a lot of background research and connecting with people across the nation, including with Dr. Sujay Kishal here at the University of Maryland, and trying to understand just what the problem was with salt. And one of the key things, and I stole this slide from him with his permission, that we found is that, it's not just about salt, it's about all the other interactions that salt causes once you unleash it on the environment. It is a weak, I think, let me maybe check my terms here. The ionic bonds that it breaks, just kind of, it may be a weak bond, but it overwhelms everything out in the system, and it causes this release of chemicals that were unanticipated, I guess, from a lot of us when we first got into trying to understand what was going on here. And this whole freshwater salinization syndrome that Sujay kind of coined was that it's not just one source that's kind of causing this. We have a number of anthropogenic sources that are contributing to this, as well as some, existing natural sources. But primarily what we're seeing on a global scale is that anthropogenic contributions of salt have been increasing over time. Next slide, please. There. And then, so what I was talking to earlier is that, when it gets into the environment, it starts releasing all these different chemicals, a lot of metals, calcium, and some other things that introduce stressors into the aquatic systems and into our drinking waters. This is something that, as you can see in the graph that he's showing, some of the different substances that we're seeing, magnesium, sulfate, calcium, and then the chloride, obviously, that's getting through. And it's not something that we had been previously paying attention to, but it is something that I think is important when we are looking at the drinking water supply and looking at how we treat water coming in from the rivers. Next slide, please. So why it matters in Maryland, we have 28 streams and rivers that have been deemed impaired according to our 303D list and a list of in our integrated report. And as you can see, a lot of that seems to be centralized in the 95 corridor. If you can go to the next slide. And that's pretty obvious. I mean, look at the roads. These are just roads, not all impervious area, but looking at just the roads in the area, there's a lot in that corridor, and a lot of that kind of corresponds to the previous map that we saw where we're seeing these impairments related to salt. Next slide, please. But the good news is that in some ways, and I apologize for the old map, I hadn't had time to update this, that a lot of it is covered under stormwater permits. So that does give us some degree of ability to do something about the impairments that are being seen in this area. Next slide. We did do a study in, I believe, at Cabin John Creek, where we had tried to identify the sources of primarily de-icing salts, because what we realized there are a number of sources of salt within the developed environment, but primarily what we're seeing impacts are from the winter and de-icing, and in particular, the term that we use is over application of salt, because people are just kind of throwing it out there without any kind of knowledge of correct application rates, how it actually works, or just doing as they're told by their boss. So one of the determinations we found out was that, yes, there's a significant contribution coming from our state highway administration to the degree of about 22% in a heavily urbanized environment. The next biggest one would be, the county, and they have a lot of small roads and things like that as well. To a lesser degree, it would have been the city of Rockville. But one of the key focuses that we took away from this was that there's a lot of privately owned parking lots and roads that have contributions to the overall impact that winter events will contribute to freshwater salinization. Now, if you'll, next slide, please. So one of the things that was done in the past is that in 2010, there was a legislation for our state highway administration to develop a salt management plan and then institute it. Now, SHA has done that. They've developed a snow college to train operators and contractors in proper winter operations. They've also, held competitions between their shops to see who could reduce the most. And they've gotten to, from the inception of that plan, they've reduced about their salt use from about 50%, which is admirable, but there's still, more we can keep doing. one of the things that we at MDE have done is taken that kind of knowledge that we've learned from SHA and others, and we've instituted some requirements in the next generation stormwater permits to make salt a priority for our jurisdictions that I showed you in the map before, the phase 1 MS4 stormwater jurisdictions, which is basically most of central Maryland. As part of that, we'll get into more detail, but we are using, monitoring to evaluate progress. But one of the other things that we looked at was this applicator certification, the voluntary applicator certification. It's an idea we stole from Minnesota and New Hampshire and a couple of other states that we thought was a really great idea. But one of the things that I really want to highlight on this talk is that education and outreach are the king in this, regulations and all that kind of stuff. They may work, but that really, most people don't even realize this is a problem or what the problem really is. And so what we're trying to do is develop partnerships with, organizations such as WSSC, University of Maryland Extension. We want to do outreach to schools and create, curriculum for, I guess, elementary through high school, just making people aware of what the problem is, because realistically, most people just don't, like I said before, just don't understand that this is a problem. And their thought is that it's a good thing because roads are open during the winter. Next slide, please. So kind of highlighting what I briefly touched on in that last slide, we will require a salt management plan that is similar in nature to what SHA has put together. I apologize, I didn't put the link in there to SHA's most recent plan, but it is fairly comprehensive. And then also the other things that you see on here, it's making sure that everyone is, made aware of how they can participate in what we're considering the smart salting program. That's a coined phrase or coined kind of like label that was done by Minnesota that we're kind of adopting as well. And what we want is to make sure that the counties, their personnel, and then anyone working for them is trained to apply salt in a responsible way. So what we're saying is, at this point, we're giving you some time to ramp up your programs to comply with the new permit, and then provide us with some information. So that's why you see, like in the 3rd year of the permit and in the 4th year, we're giving them a little bit of time to ramp it up. Now, some are ahead of the curve, some are behind the curve, but we are working with them to get them in line with our expectations. Next slide, please. So then there's the additional strategies, and I kind of touched on this before as well. The voluntary certification program, we feel, is a very important part of what MDE can contribute to this conversation. What we had heard when we talked to a lot of the permittees for the stormwater permits is that they wanted a consistent training program rather than trying to develop their own, something that can be used across the state. And hopefully, those of you that aren't in Maryland may see the utility in this as well, and we'd be willing to share and make it more of a regional program if need be, to reduce salt, because not all of the water coming into the Potomac, especially in the western portion of our state, is coming from Maryland. There's actually, most of it's coming from outside Maryland. And then the second step, developing the outreach to promote over application, or the addressing over application, excuse me. That's gonna be one of the bigger lifts, require more partners. And as part of the permit requirements, we're asking them to assist the state in the outreach efforts as well, to ensure that people are aware of the problem and how they can help in terms of doing more with less salt. And then finally, what we're trying to do is work with the University of Maryland, Penn State. We're working with the University of Minnesota and others, University of North Dakota, looking at ways to reduce our application rates and to look at new and unique ways, such as like variable speed limits during the winter to reduce the amount of salt that we use and reduce the level of service, that has been expected since the early 80s. You know, there's been a bare pavement policy that after a storm, within like an hour, you need to have the road cleared from, you know, line to line, so that, you know, people can still travel safely during the winter. Next slide, please. So that's what MDE is working on. We are currently moving into phase 2, as I like to say, is like we're going to be partnering with the University of Maryland to develop the actual courses, where we're looking at online courses and in-person courses, that we can start training people who do not necessarily like the day-to-day folks. Like there's certain levels of people within the industry, and we're talking about like landscapers and then also winter maintenance professionals. They have a lot of seasonal employees, and what we're looking to do for the seasonal employees is to create like a 5 to 10 minute training video, which we're pushes back onto the crew bosses, crew chiefs, and the folks that are running the show. Those are the ones that we want in this voluntary training program. We want them to be the drivers that then, provide this video or training to the seasonal employees, and, start bringing home that knowledge and instituting these programs, because they're the ones that are making the decisions for the most part and providing the equipment that the folks are going to be using. So along those lines, we've been building some partnerships with the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Certification folks. We're looking into there's another group, the Green Industries Council, I believe is the name of it, another landscaping group. So we're trying to build partnerships there. One of the places that I haven't been able to get, and I would love to be able to start interacting with, is emergency services personnel, the police and the firefighters, that we absolutely need to have access to roads during winter storms, but we need them to be safe as well. So we want to be able to talk with them about that. Next slide, please. So getting into the actual parts of what the training would involve. This is a really rough outline, but it basically goes over a lot of what we're looking to get out of people. The basics are why am I even here, and why does this matter to me, more or less, and then kind of a description on the background of the different chemistry and how it impacts not just the environment, but human health, infrastructure, and costs as well. So one of the things that I've come to realize is that money is going to talk more than anything else that we bring to this conversation. These are business people, and yes, they care about the environment, they care about their kids, they care about everything else, but primarily what's motivating them is, how do I provide a service to allow me to benefit financially, and to maintain my contracts with folks out there. And so that's one of I think the key drivers we're looking at. But yes, we do want people to realize that there are health impacts. I was in a training yesterday that was looking at the salt concentrations in rural parts of Pennsylvania versus, suburban and then Philadelphia. And out there, they were looking at like all of the concentrations were higher than the threshold, for people that have hypertension. So there was like a 20 milligram per liter threshold, and every sample that they took was above that threshold. So people that have like that, are doing dialysis and stuff like that, they will not be able to use that water unless they run it through some kind of membrane to filter out the salt. Those are things that we will be, kind of talking about to kind of drive home our message of it, it's not just you either, yes, we can provide you benefits by saving money and, doing the right thing, but, you will be contributing to real people and making sure that you have an impact on just not just the environment, but people's lives. The other stuff that's in here, that's all like operational, what you do during preseason, how to structure your contracts, all that stuff, directly applicable to people that are in the industry. And we anticipate that, like, every 2 to 3 years, we wanted people to come back and just kind of go through a couple of refresher courses. And just to make sure we're making it clear. Next slide, please. And then finally, one of the key things that we have in this class is a hands-on training and kind of like a lessons learned collaborative course. And one of the things that we'd like to do is, have people work with their specific equipment and have industry reps for that equipment out there to assist people with proper maintenance and or calibration. Really just to and also what could be used as a way to highlight new technologies in the industry that people can adopt to reduce the amount of salt they use while still maintaining a certain level of service and keeping people safe. And one of the crucial parts of this training would be, a practical application of how to do everything in the field during like a winter event. There's a lot that goes into what we call like enhanced winter operations, and it involves, measuring air temperature, pavement temperature, following your site plan, knowing how much to apply based on certain calculations. And so that takes some time to kind of master. And we're hoping with, this hands-on training that we give people the time and the tools that they need to be successful in that. Next, please. So here's where we are. We have been reviewing a curriculum that was created for this enhanced winter operations training or the smart salting training. And we're still developing the manual for that course. We're hoping within the time frame of now to June of next year in 2023 that we'll have fine-tuned that. We're going to run a couple of beta tests with folks in the industry, and also one of the things I kind of neglected was that we're looking at also including property management professionals, particularly in the private sector, to ensure that they are aware of what their contractors are doing and the value that they bring to the table if they're smart salt certified. But also what we want to do is open up aspects of the program for the public and for local representatives, because they're important to reach out to as well. They have great influence over what say municipal and county government employees do, and when a storm rolls through. We have drafted the regulations for this program. It's still in the review process. Hopefully this year we'll get that pushed through. And then, as I said before, we're looking to enhance a lot of our outreach efforts. We are currently chasing a grant with the University of Maryland Extension to develop the video that I talked about with for the seasonal employees, but also for some videos for the public, and to create a contest for, I think, high school and college students to create their own videos about over application and how they would message to the public, to kind of bring out that creative flavor that a lot of us at the state have just quite not mastered. Like, obviously I'm not a media major, so I don't know a lot about how to shoot videos and bring everything home in terms of the message. But hopefully with this effort, we can do some innovative things and bring some new, fresher ideas to the table. Next slide, please. So again, going with that kind of outreach focus, we want to heavily emphasize in terms of salt, public health, and cost. I know that sounds weird coming from someone that works for Maryland Department of the Environment, but I'm trying to be realistic in how we really focus the messages that will get us the results. Because if we focus on those two, then we can expect environmental benefits as well in terms of, seeing better water chemistry that will allow for organisms within, both benthic and fish to survive better within freshwater systems. Again, I mentioned the emergency management services and local elected officials. We need to bring them on board. In some areas, we're seeing that for sure. Other areas, we're seeing less of that. We're continuing to work with the reservoir groups, WSSC in particular, and we're still kind of reaching out to the Baltimore Reservoirs group. But then we need to get to people that aren't necessarily thinking about this, but have enormous influences, and that's the property management folks. They are the ones that control the money, the contracts, and if they are brought on board and see the utility and value in this, and that we can make a case for them, then that drives the contractors as well. I would say, the education in schools, that would be awesome. It's also a very big task that we need a lot of help with. And I've already talked about what we're doing with University of Maryland Extension. So next slide, please. I would encourage you, if you have a chance, we had an intern develop this story map that kind of goes through all of what I've been describing, but maybe in a better format. She's way more organized than I am. And it does give people a pretty good background. We look to develop more of these kinds of outreach materials, and in our website, if you can get to it, I could probably put it in the link later or into the chat later. We have videos on like how to drive safely in the snow, how to walk safely in the snow, like common sense things that people have kind of forgot because we've relied more on chemistry to solve our problems than actual getting used to dealing with inclement weather. Next slide, please. So I touched on this a little bit before. Is that there's a lot of research still to be done. We know that salt impacts a lot of things. We've heard from some academics that saline solutions have been used to clean out industrial filters for a long time. So we know that there's a reason for that, and that's because they do have this ionic bond exchange that pulls things away from material. The saline solutions can also lead to concretions by binding organic matter together and therefore impacting some of our stormwater BMPs that were designed for nutrients. And then finally, we just don't know, we know that salt passes through, the sodium and the chlorides pass through, and they can have devastating impacts to groundwater, but we don't know the timing and or extent a lot of the time. And so that's one of the things that we're looking as a community to figure out, just what are the longer term impacts. We know that there are persistent chemical signatures of salt in the summers that that in some ways are more indicative of how much sodium and chloride are in the environment versus the pulses that we see in the winter. But again, we just don't have a really good feel on just how broad that say in a particular BMP, how that is getting injected into the ground and into the groundwater and affecting the surrounding community. So we're working with researchers to kind of figure that out. And there's a lot of hopefully exciting papers coming from both the University of Maryland, Penn State, and some others that will help us get a better handle on that. Again, I'll let others that are way more familiar with the process, but we know that, salt begets salt in the drinking water because, if there's additional organic material within drinking water that needs to be, chlorinated, and that adds additional salt as well. We can drive up the amount that is put into finished water. What we also don't have a great deal of study on is the long-term economic impact from like a broader perspective. Like one thing's to say that I can reduce salt and this is how much I reduced it and that's how much I saved. But in terms of like overall infrastructure impacts, public health impacts, the cost for, say, you know, the WSSC plant to treat water because of salt, that I don't have a great handle on. And I think that's something that we need to understand a little bit better as well, because that is a powerful argument. If, you know, we're using this relatively low cost material that has a relatively high cost, in the end, people need to understand that. And then finally, we are working with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments on regional impacts from salt with Sujay Kisal and Stan, I can't remember his last name, from Virginia Tech. I apologize to Stan for that. But they're coordinating on looking at regional impacts in the DC metro area. Next slide, please. And that's more or less it. And I think we're ready for questions, or at least I'm ready for questions.
It's really mind-boggling how complex it really is. So thanks for helping us understand that. And I hope others will continue to put messages in the chat or contact Greg with other questions and ideas. But to keep us on schedule, I think we'll now move to the next presentation. And thanks, Greg. The next presentation is Trends in Potomac River Salt Concentrations, 1992 through 2021, by Christina Davis and Rikke Jepsen, both of ICPRB. Rikke holds a bachelor's in a BS in biology and an MS in geography and environmental systems from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Prior to joining the Interstate Commission for the Potomac River Basin on the Potomac River Basin, she spent 4 years at NASA's Goddard Space and Flight Center, mainly focused on satellite imagery analysis. She's worked at ICPRB since the late 2018 as an aquatic ecologist, where her recent projects have included determining the effectiveness of BMPs in MS4 regulated watersheds, studying groundwater flow in West Virginia using dye tracing, and assisting with a trout movement study on the North Branch Potomac. So here to talk with us is on trends in the Potomac River salt concentrations is Rikke Jepsen.
I'm actually going to get us started. This is Christy, who you should all know from multiple TWIST meetings. Renee, could you go to the next slide? So the outline for our talk today and what we wanted to share with you, I'm going to give a quick introduction, repeating some of the themes that Greg Sandi just shared about issues related to salt in natural waters like the Potomac. And then I'm going to hand it off to Rikke, who will discuss the approach that we took in terms of the data sources we had and the statistical methods she used. And then she will also share about the analysis and the outcome of her analysis as it relates to chloride, sodium, specific conductivity. And then I'll pick up and talk a little bit about population and opportunities for additional research in the future. Next slide. And again, Renee, thanks. So our analysis was focused specifically on sodium and chloride. As Greg mentioned, there are other ions that contribute to salinization, but we focused on sodium and chloride. And on the drinking water side, there are non-enforceable standards for both. There's a health-based advisory level for sodium, just for individuals who have sodium-restricted diets, and that's 20 milligrams per liter. There's not a health concern for folks who do not have any type of cardiovascular issues or sodium restrictions on their diet. There's also a secondary MCL for chloride of 250 milligrams per liter. So again, that's a non-enforceable like voluntary standard, and the goal there is to avoid any like taste issues of salty taste or aesthetic issues associated with too much chloride. In terms of ambient or natural waters, there is a water quality criterion for Virginia for chloride. This was in the SAMS toolkit. I found this. There's a 230 milligram per liter as a 4-day average for the chronic chloride water quality criterion. And then for acute, it's 860 milligrams per liter as a 1-hour average. Okay, next slide. So we know these are in no particular order. There are multiple sources of salt to the environment and to natural waters, and these include road salts, de-icing chemicals, wastewater from both residential and industrial sources, and that's turning out to be, Greg mentioned the NSF project that Stan Grant and Virginia Tech are doing, and that's been a key part of that is trying to quantify the contributions of discharges. Fertilizers and agricultural runoff can contribute salt to the environment, and then also mineral dissolution. So as minerals and rocks and dissolve, they release salts, calcium, magnesium, sulfates to the environment. Challenges in multiple sectors. Again, this is a bit of a repeat of what Greg pointed out, but there are cardiovascular issues for customers on low sodium diets, and there is that salty taste, the aesthetic problems that can be associated with freshwater salts. Conventional water treatment is ineffective for salt removal, and so the water utilities and the region are basically at the mercy of what is in the river, and we need to do everything we can to reduce salt loading to the river. And then we've seen this more famously in the Adirondacks and the Northeast region, loss of groundwater wells and drinking water sources resulting from salt contamination. Salts in the environment corrode infrastructure, water treatment plant infrastructure, but also bridges, any metal and concrete infrastructure subject to corrosion, vehicles if it's left on the road, and then also home plumbing has the potential to be corroded by excess anions in the water. And then also aquatic life toxicity. So that was the basis for the Virginia SAMS project, and the chloride TMDL led to this larger effort to reduce salt application and manage salt in Virginia. I think, yes, next slide is the approach. So I'm going to hand this off to Rikke now.
All right, thank you, Christy, and thank you, Anne, for the introduction earlier. So starting with our data sources for this analysis, we would first like to give a big thank you to Fairfax Water, WSSC Water, and the Washington Aqueduct for sharing with us their raw water chloride and sodium data. Another data source we utilized was discharge data from the Point of Rocks USGS gauge, as well as specific conductivity data, also from the Point of Rocks gauge and additionally the Little Falls gauge. And then last, we used US Census population data summed by Huck 8 for an additional analysis. Next slide, please. So this schematic here shows the relative locations of the USGS gauges that I just mentioned, and then the water supplier intakes between the two along the Potomac River. Next slide, please. And then for a more detailed look at this area, here's a map that shows the intakes, or the general area of the intakes, with the urban areas in kind of like a yellow color, and then the significant tributaries to the Potomac River are labeled. In the top left-hand corner, that's where the Point of Rocks gauge is located, and then the Little Falls gauge is at the bottom right-hand corner. And so we're not allowed to show the exact location of the intakes, but the general area of the Fairfax intake is around Sugar Land Run, Virginia. WSSC's intake is downstream of Watts Branch. In Maryland, we have Watts Branch bolded on the map. And the aqueduct is located by Great Falls on the Maryland side. And this will become relevant later, but I'd like to highlight now that the WSSC intake is in an area with a long chain of islands that split the river. I hope you can see that on the map. And this geographical feature kind of serves to constrain the flow in this area, and also it probably concentrates the pollutants, of which a major source in this area would be coming from Watts Branch, which contains runoff from the greater Rockville area. Next slide, please. For the statistical methods used, we limited the analysis time period to 1992 to 2021, and the data were averaged by month to create even time series. To visualize the data, seasonal box plots and scatter plots with low S curves were created using our software. And if there were large monthly gaps within several years, we just did a visual representation. And then to validate whether or not the trends over time were statistically significant, Mann-Kendall trend analysis was done also in R. And then last, when applicable, chloride and sodium trends were flow corrected using discharge data from the point of rocks gauge. Next slide, please. And I'll take the next one again. So moving into some of the results, here is a seasonal chloride comparison between the water supplier intakes. And again, remember, this is the raw water. And note that for all the slides I'll be showing, the plots will be presented from the most upstream to downstream intake, going from left to right. And the main purpose of these box plots is to show that all of the outliers or the spikes in chlorides occur during the winter and the spring months. And this really points to road salting after snow and ice storms as the major source of chlorides. Next slide, please. So now we'll go more into the chloride trend analysis. So presented here are the scatter plots showing the data points of chloride, and they do suggest, just look visually, a large increase over time in the raw water chloride at especially WSSC's intake and the aqueduct, less so at Fairfax. And the Mann-Kendall method provides p-values, which are listed under the provider names. And the lower the p-value, the more confidence we have in concluding that there is a significant trend. So with that, the WSSC and Washington aqueduct intakes have low p-values, which suggest stronger increasing trends compared to Fairfax, which has a larger and less significant p-value. And something interesting that I want to note here is that despite not being the furthest downstream intake, WSSC actually sees the highest chloride spikes. And we think this may be due to several different factors, including the inputs from the nearby Watts Branch coincident with those river islands that are probably constraining the salt to the Maryland side. And there are also, I believe, some upstream wastewater treatment plants not too far away. Next slide, please. So flow correction is a method that's used to remove the diluting effect of flow, or in other words, to take out flow as a confounding factor. And this method was applied to each of the chloride data sets using the point of rocks flow data. And performing flow correction, like I said, leads to greater confidence in trends as these large precipitation events don't influence the trend. This is really highlighted by Fairfax water, whose chloride trend became slightly more significant when flow corrected. And the last set of numbers up there are percent increases. These more or less eyeballed, so they're approximate, don't report them out. We can calculate them like for real later, but they do give an idea of how much of a substantial increase there was in chlorides once flow corrected in this 30-year period. So for example, the raw water chloride at the aqueduct rose approximately 200% in 30 years. Next slide, please. So now we'll transition into looking at sodium. So here are the seasonal box plots by the water suppliers again. It's a really similar story to chloride, but the sodium concentrations are a bit lower than chlorides. There, we see the similar spikes in or outlier values in the winter and spring, which again provides more evidence that the source of this is sodium chloride rather than hardness, for example. Next slide, please. All right, so now we'll take a look at the scatter plots again and the trend analysis. So at Fairfax, I do just want to note that there were some censored monthly data earlier in the time series, which are those like below zero values. This just means that those values were below the detection limit of the method that was used. It's not a bad thing. It just means that, yeah, that the machine couldn't read off what the value was because it was between the detection limit and 0. So, however, since there was just one detection limit, the same analysis method could be used. For the aqueduct, the sodium data did have some larger monthly gaps in several years earlier in time. So this prevented a full trend analysis from being done. However, if you kind of eyeball the trend, it does seem to show increasing sodium over time. We just don't have a p-value to support that. But looking at the trend results for Fairfax, the sodium trend is actually really similar to chloride. I think the p-value is even the same. So it's like a weekly significant increase over time. For WSSC, the raw water showed less of an increase in sodium than chloride, but the increase was still statistically significant. And I think it's kind of interesting to see that between about 2006 and 8, there's kind of a peak in sodium, and then it decreases slightly after that. But the values later in time are still elevated compared to 1992. Next slide, please. So to do for the flow correction, this method was only applicable to the WSSC sodium data due to either the censoring or the gaps that we saw in the other data sets. And so once flow corrected, the p-value did become smaller as expected, and our confidence in this trend being a real trend is increased. And the approximate increase was about 150% in sodium. Next slide, please. And so now moving on to a slightly different analysis. This was done by ICPRB's Claire Buchanan. She did a comparison of specific conductance between the upstream Point of Rocks gauge and the downstream Little Falls gauge using linear regression. And specific conductance was used as it's a good indicator of salts in solution. And so the plots on the left show that, if you can kind of make that out, I believe this will be posted. You can zoom in if you want. So the plots show that in the early 90s, conductivity was actually higher at Point of Rocks, which is the top plot and the more upstream gauge. And that was likely due to upstream karst geology. And the influence of this karst is diluted by runoff going downstream. But then the inputs from salts or inputs of salts from urban areas along the way then bumps up the conductivity again. And so overall, the specific conductance at the Little Falls gauge has increased about 13% in 30 years since 1992 due to these watershed contributions, whereas this level has stayed about the same at Point of Rocks. All right, so now I'll be passing it back to Christy.
Great. And next slide, please. The last analysis we wanted to look at was population as a surrogate for urbanization and increasing growth in the region. So Stephanie Newmer from ICPRB pulled down the census data from 2000, 2010, and 2020. We really would have liked to have included 1990 to more closely align with the dates of the analysis that Rikke completed, but unfortunately 1990 was not available online for her. But the map here shows a pretty compelling trend in terms of urbanization growth in the region. The middle dark blue Huck 8 is the Middle Potomac Catoctin. That's the Huck 8 that includes the Point of Rocks and all 3 of the intakes for these water treatment facilities. And so that is where the focus of this analysis was, the river as it flows through the Middle Potomac Catoctin Huck 8. And then you can see that that particular Huck 8 plus the 2 on either side, the Shenandoah and the Monocacy in dark blue, saw pretty substantial population increases over the last 20 years from 2000 to 2020 in the range of 33 to 40, let's see, 9% is the dark blue. So I guess it topped out at 46% in the Shenandoah Huck 8. And then as we move away from the district and out north and west, the lighter blue, the Conococheague and Opequon, and then the North Fork and Shenandoah, they saw still pretty substantial population increases, but not as great as the darker blue. And similarly, the South Fork, Shenandoah, and then followed by the Capon and Town saw double-digit population increases as well. We did see in the far western part of the basin, the North Branch and South Branch Potomac, those actually had negative population increases. So they lost population numbers over the last 20 years. But this certainly builds the case, along with the analyses that Rikke was showing, that there's a very strong and direct relationship between population, urbanization, and increasing salt levels in the Potomac. Next slide, please. And so we just, as any good science project does, this opened up a lot of questions for us as we were looking at the results and pondering, you know, what could be said about them beyond the fact that these increases are occurring. And so it just raised these, oh, I'm sorry, could you go to the next slide, please? These questions about opportunities for future research. So for example, is there a significant correlation? So can we more directly tie the increasing salinity to increasing urbanization, as indicated by changes in population and impervious surface, and then presumably perhaps decreases in forest and tree cover? Another critical question that we thought of was, in addition, did we skip a slide? Can you go back? There we go. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so the first question on our list for future consideration is, what are the relative positions and flow rates of the permitted discharges and drinking water intakes? So where are wastewater or industrial waste facilities putting waste streams into the Potomac, and how do those relate to where the intakes are? So Rikke talked about the tributaries, but what about the permitted discharges? Then what is the relationship between the flow rates and the salt concentrations actually in the tributaries, and how do they affect the concentration that we see at the drinking water intakes as well in the raw water? To what extent does stormwater and runoff affect salinity, and how does river geography and morphology? So Rikke talked about those long islands and how they restrict flow and take away from the ability of upstream flow rates to dilute influent salts. And so how do those affect more specifically what we're seeing in terms of raw water salt constituents? Next slide. And then again, is there a significant, can we tie a very strong relationship or correlation between the salinity and the signs of urbanization? And then the final research question that we came up with for future work is, in addition to these winter salt programs, like we just heard about from Maryland and the Virginia SAMS work, what other programs or actions do we need to reverse the trend of increasing salinity in the Potomac River? Next slide. And finally, we want to acknowledge the Aqueduct, WSSC Water, and Fairfax Water, who graciously provided their data. The funding came from EPA Region 3, Section 106 Clean Water Act grant, and the photo credit from ICPRB. And with that, we can entertain questions.
Thank you, everybody. I'll go ahead and take the opportunity to thank everybody for attending, and look forward to seeing you at the next meeting, which will be what date, Christy?
November 2nd, and we'll tackle whether that's going to be virtual or in person at that planning meeting I mentioned that I'm planning to hold with the chairs of choice, but we will send out this week an invitation for WebEx, so it's a hold on your calendar.
Okay. All right, so look forward to hopefully seeing you in person, maybe virtual, at the annual meeting, November 2nd. And thanks for tuning in today. We are hereby adjourned.